Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, my other stuff. Okay, appreciate it. Sorry about that. Oh, we gotta let somebody know about it yesterday. That's all right. I'm sure that's like. Yeah, I don't know if we ever make it. I haven't played that in years. It's been a long time. Real long time. Hey, bro. How's it going? Really, but close. Are you good? Just getting ready. So, who won yesterday? Charlie won one. I was just throwing. Your mom was over here. Sit over there with her. That's nice of you. Come on, man. You wear whatever pants she tells you. Whatever Brooke. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's not a friend. Just out the other day, but I hadn't noticed it before.
Yeah. Just over a year.
Was it here again? Can't pay attention to part of it.
You know, my name's not on there. It's on the door, but
Yeah, it's on the door.
It's a State Farm sign.
That's where it's always been.
Yeah. Come on, show me sometime. Oh, once, but it's bound. Hot here. Hot to me anyway. Well, I guess we can go ahead and get started. We're a little early, but we'll go ahead and get started. Leaving a few minutes shorter than normal. Before we get going, Mike has agreed to lead us in prayer before class.
Let's pray. Our Holy Heavenly Father, we are so thankful, Lord, for this wonderful day that you have given to us and all the blessings that you have given to us. Thank you, Lord, for watching over us as your people and being with us in so many ways that we can't even imagine. God of all. You see all, you can do all, and we are thankful that we can call you our God. We are thankful for the plan that you have through Christ and all that he has done for us. We are thankful that he was willing to give himself up so that we can have the hope of an eternal life that we can have with you, away from this world that is failing, that is falling apart. And as beautiful as it is, sometimes we realize that this world is not meant to be. It is not our eternal home. Help us, Lord, to focus on our eternal destination. Focus on Christ in everything that we do. We are thankful, Lord, that you have left us your word, that we can study it and see the ways that you impact us and impact the lives of those that follow you. Help us, Lord, to study that word now, to focus on it so that we can realize more what you do for your people, the people that love you and the people that you love. We are thankful, Lord, that we can study it now. We ask that as we dive into your word, that we learn from it. We ask that you be with the teachers that have prepared for this time, be with them to help them to recall the things that they have studied. We are eternally grateful for Christ and all that he has done, and it's in his name that we pray all these things.
And we're in lesson number 8 this morning. We've kind of switched going into Wednesday, Sunday into lessons because we covered one lesson over 3 class periods. So it's going to take a little adjustment. Wednesday, Sunday, Wednesday, Sunday, Wednesday, Sunday. So just kind of getting that routine. We'll work on finish lesson 8 today. We're studying Esther. So just kind of for those of you all weren't here on Wednesday, we started on lesson 8. And we talked a little bit about the background of Xerxes, the king, Ahasuerus, what was going on in the Persian Empire at that time. And we'll kind of recap a little bit of that before we dive into Esther. This week we're covering chapter 1 and chapter 2. Depending on how far we get today, I may not finish chapter 2. I may not get through all the questions. We'll just have to see. And I may let some of that bleed over into next week. Next week's lesson covers chapter 3 and chapter 4. And that's only about 30 verses. So we've got a week on about 30 verses, so you could read it about 10 times.
Don't be a Haman.
Yeah, don't be a Haman, right? So we'll get into that. Next week, if the technology works, I'll show a video on Wednesday probably around some of the battles around that time and why some of the things might have happened in Esther, just kind of some secular history of what was going on with the Persian Empire and the Greek Empire. I found it interesting to help my study a little bit in preparing for Esther. So we'll do that next week. Before we jump in, just as a reminder, the Persian Empire, Xerxes or Ahasuerus was the king of Persia. And Persia covered about 2/3 the population of the known world at that time. Their influence and their reign went all the way from India all the way over to the edge of Greece. And so we'll see next week a little bit where they go in and try to take over Greece. And that didn't go too well for them. During this kind of time period, he had rebellions in several different areas. One of those was Egypt. So he was the king of Egypt, basically, at this time. All the way from India down to Egypt and all the way up to Greece. That was a lot of people and a lot of different nations that used to be independent, but were subservient to Persia at the time. So that gives you a feeling of the power he had and the wealth that they had, and Esther is right there in the center of all that. All right, so this was kind of more of a step back, a little bit more of the world map. There weren't a whole lot of people outside of that, we don't believe, kind of area. Different people around the world. I showed that on Sunday or Wednesday as well. And as a reminder, we looked at this on Wednesday as well, just kind of an overview of the book of Esther. Chapter 1, chapter 2 cover a handful of years. It's quite a bit of time, actually. So Ahasuerus in chapter 1 is going to hold these banquets that we'll talk about. I believe this is before he goes on his campaign to Greece and tries to attack Greece and take over Greece. It's 4 years later, Esther goes to Ahasuerus. And in that time, you can see some of the people around the king, Xerxes or Ahasuerus, reacting kind of oddly. You know, they're doing some things that might not happen, maybe in the best of times. And I think that's because, the king got, his army pretty well defeated in Greece somewhere around 480 BC. So that's helpful, at least for me, to kind of understand Esther a little bit more. And then you see it in this timeline. Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3 covers a lot of time, and then the rest of the book, it's all kind of within a year. So it goes real fast. All right. Author. Who was the author of Esther? You don't know. Who might it be? If you don't know, who could it be?
Could be Mordecai or Ezra. Some just, maybe even just some Jews who lived during that time.
Could be. Yeah. So there's a lot of speculation on that. So I think Mordecai's a good choice, that he might be one, but it could have been someone else. It had to be somebody that's pretty well familiar with what was going on at the time. So I put up here, familiar with Persian society. So you would have to at least know what was going on within the king's household, what was going on around him. Mordecai fits that. Others would fit that as well. You'd have to kind of know why certain things were happening and who was involved and all the plots that were involved. There's a lot of, the king's having trouble sleeping, so he asked somebody to come read a book to him. I mean, like which one of you all had somebody come read a book to you all when you had trouble sleeping? I mean, that's kind of what's going on here. And so somebody would have to know those types of things to be able to record them. So also, it would have to be kind of after this time period. Obviously, it can't be before. I mean, it's stating the obvious, but Mordecai is probably one of the leading candidates, possibly writing the book, but there's no indication that that's actually what happened. So it had to be, after all these events. So author here estimates, maybe 465 to 450, maybe even later. One of the most interesting things about Esther is that God is not mentioned in that book, but his providence is seen. What do you all think of that? No mention of God, no preview of Jesus to come.
We see the works of God all around us every day, and that's the way I think of that in this book.
Yeah. Well, we just studied Ezra and Nehemiah, which kind of bookend, kind of around this time period, before and after. And you saw God working through kings, right, over and over. And so you can see God working, through this king, through Esther and through Mordecai, for his people that were still in the process of returning to the land.
God is not mentioned directly, but God is implied all the way through it.
Mm-hmm.
His providence is implied all the way through it.
Yeah. Let's go to chapter 4, verse 14. Whoever would like to read, go ahead and read that for us.
For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to this kingdom for such a time as this.
So this is probably the most famous passage, most memorable passage in all of Esther. And, this is one that I think we can pause and think about for ourselves. Who knows whether you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this? I mean, you can change that around, and who knows why I've been put in the situation I've been put in, or, maybe there's a reason for why I'm in the situation I'm in. I mean, you can apply that to yourselves today. Maybe it's, we are here for a reason, right? And so who knows whether we've been put in a position to reflect God to others or reflect Christ to others. I'm sure all of us can kind of look back in our lives and certain things that have happened. You're like, I don't really know why that happened, but it worked out, and I was there. I had an opportunity that was presented to me that wouldn't have just naturally happened on a normal everyday situation. I'm sure each one of you all can kind of think of some of those things. That's probably one of the most important things I think we can take out of this. So we definitely see the providence of God. We see God in here, even though he's not mentioned. All right, chapter 1. I mentioned this piece last Wednesday. would like to read the first 8 verses of chapter 1? We're going to do a lot of reading in Esther because it's a good story, and we'll have to probably work our way through it, talk about it. Who would like to read the first 8 verses? You got it? All right, thanks, Cindy.
This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. And in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all of his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. For a full 180 days, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant, in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink in his own way, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished.
Yeah, that's good enough. So, thank you. So, he has a feast for 180 days. I mean, we just went through a change in president. We do that about every 4 years. There's a swearing-in ceremony, then, there's a banquet, and there's a little pomp and circumstance around that every time you have a changeover in our president. Now, this guy, I mean, he has a party for 180 days. That's, to me, is unheard of. That's half a year. I mean, that's half a year. You've got a feast going on. So you can imagine if he's bringing everybody in. They're traveling from all over his kingdom. It takes them a while to get there. Probably a couple months to get there. They're there for a long time, and he's holding a feast for 180 days. And the army's gathered. And the thought is that this is where they're thinking about, what do we do about Greece? We need to go deal with Greece. And we're bringing in all his people, counselors, to have a conversation around that. But he's also showing off all his wealth. Has that worked out well for kings in the past?
Never.
Never? I found some pictures. I'll probably bring them next week of their treasury. So they have a building that was their treasury. And it's like right there in the main capital area. And, it's the ruins of it obviously now, but you normally don't bring in all your neighbors and say, hey, this is what all I have, and you talk about all your wealth because you become a target. I mean, you show them where all the gold is, and they're going to want to come take it, right?
That's how it's saying, pride comes before a fall.
Yeah. And so, not only are you just having a feast for half a year, but you're showing off all your stuff. And one of the things that stuck out to me was just how lavish this palace was and all the things that they had. It was a nice place. Yes, they're in kind of what's the desert in Iran now, but this place was nice. They had all kinds of nice things. So they even had gold cups. I've got a picture of some of those here on the next slide here. That we'll show you that. But all right. So verse.
Hey, John.
Yeah.
I just read this, it doesn't matter, I guess, but when you read in verse 4, when it said, he showed the riches of his kingdom, the 180 days in all. And when these days were completed, the king made a feast lasting 7 days. Was the feast 7 days, but yet 180 days? He was having people in to show everything?
I took it as he's got all of it going on for 180 days.
Okay.
That's the way I took it.
But why does it say when these days were complete? Maybe it's just, I was never good at comprehension, so.
The feast starts there in verse 3. That he made a feast for all his officials.
Yep.
It lasted 180
Okay.
days. Yep. After that, he asked another one for
There's a feast on a feast on a feast. I mean,
Okay.
that's the way I take it. It's just,
Okay.
it's ongoing. You know, is it 187 or is it 180? I don't know, but like, what's the difference? And like, I don't know how you keep the weight off when you're eating that much for that long, but you know, it seems to be an ongoing. It's too much. You know, it's just too much. It seems exorbitant, unnecessary, quite honestly.
The notes in my Bible said this week was like the climax or the end of the 180. It kind of was the grand all, end all, you know, feast, if you will. So.
And one of the things that popped out to me here in verse 8, I'll read 7 and 8 again. Drinks were served in golden vessels of different kinds. And the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king, and drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion, for the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. To do as each man desired. So, king's order, back then the king's order was the king's order. Everybody could do whatever they wanted. And he brought all these people in and do whatever you want. That's just abnormal. Normally when you're going to a feast of an authority figure, you're on your best behavior, you're going to follow the orders, you're going to sit where you're told, you're going to be extra polite, you know, all those types of things, but do whatever you want. Like,
it almost seems like the feast for 180 days versus the 7 might be a different audience, because in the 180 days, it almost seems like he's pulling in anyone from everywhere. Like, the audience is, hey, everyone come and we'll entertain you for 180 days. But then almost the 7 days almost seems like it's closer. It's all the people in Citadel, like only the Citadel in Susa, right? A very small audience. And I'm trying to compare something similar into my mind, like, you know, like you have been on a project for 6 months, and you've been doing a whole bunch of things for 6 months with an enormous group, and then at the end of that, you take all those team players, you say, look, we have been at this for 6 months. You have done an enormous amount of work. We're just going to relax for 7 days. Guys, do whatever you want, kind of thing. That's almost kind of how I took it, just because the audience was different and it was closer people in Susa.
Yeah. And maybe those were the hosts that were serving, if you will, all the guests that
Like
were possibly. It's a possibility. Yeah, that's a good thought.
Well, the editor of our book, he said that when he looked at it or whatever, says that for the 6-month period, that it's more like a time of meetings or whatever. Mm-hmm. That they were like there to discuss like maybe the invasion of Greece or whatever.
Yeah, I think that was going on as well. So they weren't just eating for 6 months. I think they were having a lot of meetings. His counselors were in, you know, leaders of his army, his armies that were around. I think that's what was going on. They were kind of planning what they're going to go do about Greece. They had to get themselves organized. I mean, you can't just call people up. You can't just fly somewhere back then. It's a lot of travel involved. Verse 9. Verse 9, Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to the king Ahasuerus. So you're going to see a pattern of the king having feast and then the queen having feast. And so even at the same time, Vashti was having a feast. So Vashti was Xerxes' wife, and obviously the queen. And did anyone look up what her name means?
Beautiful.
Yeah, beautiful. Her name means beautiful. So that'll show up here in several of the stories going forward, I guess. All right, let's read verses 10 through 12. Who would like to read that?
I will. On the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbana, Bigtha, Abatha, Zathar, and Carpus, 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown in order to show her beauty to the people and to the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him.
Yeah, so her name's beautiful, and he basically says, come out here, I want to show you off to all my friends. And she refused. refused the king. Remember, 2/3 of the world, king of the world, refused. How did that go for her? Not well. And the king, we talked a little bit about this on Wednesday, that at least the Greek history around him would say that he was a tyrant. Like he was one not to be messed with. He had an anger problem, I guess. And we see that here in verse 12. The king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. So the king was, put in an interesting spot in front of all his subjects and all the people that came in from his kingdom. And, she stepped out, I guess, with somebody that we saw that the king had killed people, We saw that on Wednesday. He killed some people, at least secular history says, what he did with people that refused to serve in the army. And so she's putting him in an interesting position. And so she's pretty bold in doing this, I guess. Let's read 13 through 18. Whoever would like to read.
Then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for it was the custom of the king so to speak before all who knew the law and justice and were close to him, Karshina, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Nereus, Marsina, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media who had access to the king's presence and sat in the first place in the kingdom. According to law, what is to be done with Queen Vashti, because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs? In the presence of the king and the princes, Memucan said, Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but also all the princes and all the people who are in all provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, causing them to look with contempt on their husbands by saying, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought in to his presence, but she did not come. This day the ladies of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's conduct will speak in the same way to all the king's princes, and there will be plenty of contempt and anger.
Wow, right? So the king brought in his counselors, people that knew the law, and says, what's supposed to be done with her, according to the law? Did they answer his question?
Not directly.
Not directly?
Well, around the yet.
They didn't address her at all.
Right.
They addressed what they were afraid was going to happen as a result.
Yeah.
Right.
They didn't give him a legal answer. They brought his legal counselors in and was looking for a legal answer and didn't get a legal answer. Got more of an emotional, how people are going to respond, a political answer. I found that pretty interesting. They didn't even answer his question. All right, let's go into verse 19. Somebody read 19 and 20. We'll see what happens next.
If it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. For when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike.
So that'll do it. We'll just order her away, and all the other women will obey their husbands, basically, based on the king's order. Is that how it works?
Well, John, do you think, like what you said, if it pleases the king, they were afraid of the king.
Yeah.
They want to say, well, if this is okay with you, maybe you should do this. And then maybe it was just a cultural, unwritten law that women should do what their husbands said.
Yeah.
And here they're going to make it law. Is that what they're doing?
I'm not sure about the culture, so I can't judge the culture. I mean, every culture and time is a little bit different in expectations and norms and things like that. It's probably the case, but it's interesting to me because they never answer his question, and then they come back and say, if it pleases the king, let an order go out. So basically, they probably didn't have a law against it, and so they're, okay, we'll go make one. If it pleases the king is a great observation, because I think we'll see that later in the book when Esther goes before the king. If it pleases the king, if it pleases the king, if it pleases the king. I don't know if that's a traditional way of addressing the king, but I think it's a statement of fear when you go in front of somebody. If it's okay with you, if it pleases you.
Trying to tell him to do something nicely.
Yeah, or like, I've got an idea, but only if it makes you happy.
Yeah.
Because the king was angry. The king was angry here. I remember back a couple verses, he was angry, and he was angry for a long time. And we know from secular history he had an anger problem, and he was considered a tyrant. That was the word that historians used. He was a tyrant, and very prideful person. And clearly he commanded much of the world. So, you could imagine it probably go to your head, I guess, if you were king of that much of the world.
John, I think it's interesting that neither the king nor any of his advisors just said, off with their head, as would seem to be the case in a position, in a temperament and a reputation that he had.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of surprising that neither he nor any of his advisors even suggested that. They just said, no, just move her out. Let somebody else in.
And maybe that makes her suffer even more. I don't know by being banished. I don't know how people would perceive that, but we know from secular history, we talked about that on Wednesday, that there were other wives probably involved with King Xerxes, and he had, one of them at least, I think, killed as an example.
Just going back to what we read though previously in the chapter, this whole setting, this whole conversation is after a 6-month drinking jag, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, you don't know what their state of mind is. You don't know if they're, on the angry side of alcohol, on the sad side of alcohol. I mean, you just don't know. But this is, just understand the setting.
Yeah.
Everything is transpired. I mean, the Bible's very specific in what it tells us, and it tells us, they've been feasting, partying, drinking, whatever you want to call this, for 6 months. I mean, you just don't know what the mindset is.
Well, and to that point, it's a good point, Joe, that they're gearing up for war as well, because they're going to go battle the Greeks. That's brought their army and counselors in because they're getting ready to go to fight the Greeks. So and if you're getting your mind ready for war, you don't want to deal with some problems at home. You don't want anybody to think you're weak. You don't want anybody to think like you can get something over on me. Don't mess with me. I'm going to go fight. And so there's probably some of that as well. All right. So we get an order going out. Who'd like to read 21 and 22? We've got the order going out here.
I will. This word pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province according to its script, and to every person and to every people according to their language, that every man should be the master of his own house, and the one who speaks in the language of his own people.
So the word goes out that all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. Back in verse 20. So that's the message. It goes out in everyone's own language, so it's not like I couldn't read that. And speak according to the language of his people. So you can't speak another language even in your household. It seems like to me, the way I interpret that. But the word goes out. All right. I found a couple pictures. These are cups that were discovered from around that time. I can't say that these were the ones that were there, but that looks like something that is described in here. Different types of gold cups. I don't have any of those at home.
Every cup was different, right?
Everyone was different. You can see their hand fashion. At the top edge of it is, it's not perfect. It's handmade. So it seems something like that was probably what they had. It could even been these. There are a few other pictures out there. If you search around on the internet, you're looking for things like that. Those are in, I think, a museum in Iran, I believe. All right, get into,
what she had done and what had been decreed against her. And the king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in the provinces of his kingdom, and that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan, the citadel, and into the women's quarters under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women, and let beauty preparations be given them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This thing pleased the king, and he did so.
so what do y'all think about this?
Who would say no to that? You know, you didn't have a really
Well, I mean, you saying that from a woman's perspective or a man's perspective?
man.
Speaking of that, do you think the women had a choice?
Doesn't really seem like
If
it.
they did.
Doesn't seem like it, right?
No.
Doesn't-
But you never know.
Let them, they're sought and they're going to be brought in.
They may have wanted to. If you're buying something in the country, I mean,
Maybe some would. I don't know. That just something that struck me. I'm like, okay, you can read it from both different angles. The king took a while to get over his anger, and when he got over it, he remembered what had happened, and all his people around him had an idea. All right, his attendants have an idea. Okay, let me bring some other women in here for you to choose from. And I don't know that they had a choice. The way I interpret it. And so again, they had an idea, and into verse 4, this pleased the king, and he did so. So they're giving him ideas. Like, it's got to be the king's decision. He's clearly in charge. They're not doing things for him. They're giving him ideas, and he's like, oh, okay, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's do that.
John, one thing I read said that, the king, back when he was having all this drinking party, he was drunk and angry and acted in haste. And now that he's had time to sober up, maybe he realized he really liked Vashti and didn't want to get rid of her, and that some of his officials realized that's what he was leaning towards. And so that's why they floated this idea of getting a replacement for her.
It's possible. It's possible. If you believe the timeline that I had earlier, this might be up to 4 years later. So he could have been angry for a long time. It could have been a while. Like, he could have been angry, then went off to war, then come back, and then, it appears like this is continuous here in between chapter 1 and 2, but I think he went off to war and came back. So it's hard to say.
I also kind of think that he felt like he couldn't go against his own edict, or ruling, I don't know, some other kings, I think, have read in the Bible that, once they make an edict or a ruling, and of course he sent that whole ruling out to the whole nation, so he couldn't then come back and do the thing that he ruled against, of course he's king, I guess he could have, but it would have been a bad image for him.
Yeah. We see that with the Babylonians and the Persians kind of in Ezra, and then even later in Nehemiah, that when the king does have an edict, that's what's done, and you can't go against the king's edict. So it was very much they said, it was stamped, you got to do it, no choice. And undoing what was said before was difficult.
John?
Yeah.
In addition to all of that, if they had gone back on the king's edict, where he's the king, he could go back on the edict.
Mm-hmm.
They saw that there was benefit in what it did to them, for all their wives to be, obedient to them. And so if he were to go back, he was not only going to affect him, he was going to affect their household.
It's a great observation. Yeah. Yeah, because they were the ones that were worried about, okay, how are they all going to respond? If she can do that to the king, then I'm not the king. I can't be the king of my house. She's not going to obey in whatever way I want her to obey. Yeah, it's a great observation.
Which makes more sense
probably didn't have a choice when they were together, the girls, right, probably didn't have a choice.
I don't think they had a choice the way it looks. And we'll see that later with Mordecai. You know, he goes by and checks on her every day, like to make sure she's okay and stuff. But it's not like, you don't see her say, yeah, I want to put my name in the hat for that.
And just remembering the culture of the time, women couldn't support themselves. So this was a way to be supported. I mean,
Yeah.
just couldn't say, no, I'm going to take care of myself. There were no stable little women back then, really.
Yeah, and the whole family unit was different back then as well. You know, more larger families lived together. But you're right. You know, there's an agricultural society back then, unless you were in the city and had some kind of skill, and so you had to work in the fields. You had to have kids and workers that would work in the field with you and for you. All right, let's look at who Mordecai was. Who would like to read 5 through 7? Learn a little bit about Mordecai.
Now there was at the citadel of Susa a Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish of Benjamin, who had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the captives who had been exiled when Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had exiled. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had no father or mother. Now the young lady was beautiful in form and face, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter.
All right, so who's this Mordecai?
He's a relative, apparently, of Saul, King Saul. Kish was
Benjamin.
Benjamin.
Yep.
Kish was Saul's father. So.
He's the nephew of Esther's father.
Nephew, yeah.
Esther's cousin.
Esther's cousin, yeah. So if he's raising Esther, he's got to be older than her. So it's not like I've got cousins, you know, younger and older than me, but not old enough to raise me. You know, some of us might have cousins that are much younger or older, that you could have an age separation. Goes back to the captivity, the Babylonian captivity. So he was his ancestors were some of those that were taken away into captivity when Judah fell, the nation, the southern kingdom fell, which was the final kingdom to fall. So he'd been in captivity for a while. His family had been in captivity for a while, but he could show his heritage. He knew what tribe he was from. We saw some other Jews that were in captivity. They couldn't prove which tribe they were from, right? He could prove which tribe he was from because he had a record of all his lineage. That was just a little tidbit that I found interesting in there. That he clearly was a Jew. He wasn't some kind of person that had been mixed in with the nations around them. He was truly a Jew, and so that would, with Esther being his cousin, Esther was definitely a Jew as well, which is another thing we get in here, marrying a Persian king, and that, her being a Jew was hidden for quite some time. All right, so we see, just a couple notes on that. All right, Esther. Her name, Hadassah. That was Hebrew meaning myrtle, and Esther is actually her Persian name meaning star. I've got a star, so I have to change her name, I guess. So let's read verses 8 through 11.
I'll read it. So it came about when the command and decree of the king were heard, and many young ladies were gathered to the citadel of Susa in the custody of Hegai, that Esther was taken to the king's palace into the custody of Hegai, who was in charge of the women. Now the young lady pleased him and found favor with him. So he quickly provided her with cosmetics and food, gave her 7 choice maids from the king's palace, and transferred her and her maids to the best place in the harem. Where do you want me to read to 11?
11, if you would, please.
Esther did not make known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had instructed her that she should not make them known. Every day Mordecai walked back and forth in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and how she fared.
So how do we see God's providence here? We talked about it throughout the whole book. How do we see God's providence here?
It's similar to what Joseph experienced, how he would find favor in the eyes of the leaders.
Mm-hmm. Good comparison. He's on the fast track. You know, he was on the fast track. She's on the fast track. She found favor with the individual that she was in custody of, Haggai, who's in charge of the women. And so, I mean, she made an impression pretty quickly. And she got a favored position. I mean, she got support. She got cosmetics and her portion of food. I wasn't sure what to make of her portion of food. I don't know what that means. I thought everybody would get food, but maybe she got a little bit more, or maybe it was better food.
Mine said special.
Oh, she got special food? Maybe it was better food.
Or maybe it was like Daniel. He wasn't allowed to eat certain things, so she wanted to get, that. She wanted.
Well, if she was a Jew, then she would not have eaten certain things,
Right.
So maybe that's the connection. It could be. But, at the same time, she didn't make known her people or her kindred, verse 10. For Mordecai commanded her not to make it known.
Yeah.
So,
Well, it's our bologna, he wants one steak.
maybe so. Maybe so. I don't know anybody that would eat bologna, but, that stuff looks gross.
There's a few of us that do.
Yeah.
So do you have to fry it to eat it?
Yeah. Fried bologna sandwich.
You eat it raw.
We grew up on that.
Tennessee round steak.
Oh my goodness. We've lost all kinds of control here. West Virginia ham. Yeah, every state has the state next to them that they make fun of, right? All right, so we'll see later, the cosmetics piece, comes in here a little bit. We'll see a little bit story of like what the tradition was for all these women, but she's given a lot of things that she clearly didn't have before, and she was given 7 young women to kind of serve her from the king's palace. So again, I sat back and think about that's where God's providence is. I mean, it's not that she just got some kind of favoritism. Like, she's in the king's household. She's in the king's household. Again, this is the king of Persia, 2/3 of the known world, and she, as a Jew, slips into the king's household and is favored amongst all her peers.
But to start off, she won the beauty contest.
Yeah.
That's how she got in.
Yeah. Well, she was picked. She was selected.
And that could have been part of God's hand in that too.
Yes, from the very beginning.
Prettiest one, most desired.
Yeah. Or you can even go back further, like her parents were dead, right? Her parents had died. So, maybe that was part of his plan as well. And so that's the piece that I think about that today. How do we apply this today, right? We are Christians. We're supposed to operate and behave a certain way in whatever situation we find ourselves in, right? And so we can kind of look at the situation and say, well, why did this happen to me? Why me? I mean, that can be a separate study. Why did whatever happen to me? Well, who knows whether we've been put in a position to glorify God because of what's happened to us. And whether it's a good thing, like being taken into the king's household, or, something that's unpleasant that happens to us. I mean, you got to see how God is using us in those situations.
Hey, John.
Yes.
And Esther had to take action, but look who she was taking instruction from, and it was really Mordecai. So Mordecai is also providentially her caregiver and tell him what.
Yeah, it's a good point, really good point. So he was there to provide for her. Had he not been there, then the situation would be different. And it's also maybe a lesson in how, I'll call him a father to her, right? Like how the fathers are to be for their children, to kind of guide them in the way and correct them when they're doing things incorrectly, and how the children are to respond to their father. She obeyed Mordecai. Mordecai told her not to make it known, and she didn't make it known. All kinds of lessons in here. So yeah, while God's not mentioned, we're seeing God all over the place. All right, let's read 12 through 14. Who'd read that? Let's see what she's doing after she's taken into this harem.
When the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus after the end of her 12 months under the regulations for the women, the days of their beauty treatment were completed as follows: 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with psalm oil and the cosmetics for women. The young woman would go into the king in this way. Anything that she desired was given to her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would enter, and in the morning she would return to the second harem, to the custody of Shazgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king was delighted in her and she was summoned by name.
So how long did it take Esther to get herself ready? A year. So how many times have we complained? Can we get out of the house? It took her. It took her a year. I guess it was a custom back then. There were regulations for the women. We don't have recorded what those are. We don't know what those regulations were. But it took 12 months for her to get herself ready to be in front of the king, at least. That's a long time. I mean, I think you could take a quick bath, get a haircut, do a couple things, and be ready in a day or two, maybe. But a year, that's a long time.
Don't you think that was the rule? They had to all have 12 months, don't you think?
Yeah, there was regulations, whatever those regulations were. I don't know anything about the regulations for the women, but there clearly must have been a written law about that. We don't have those things recorded. Again, this is one of those things that, like through history, when one nation conquers another and they sack the nation that they conquer, burn everything, you lose a lot of records. You lose history books. You lose the written anything unless it's carved into stone. So that's why we don't know about a lot of these things. But apparently there was a law of some sort around the expectation, regular period of their beautifying. 12 months. Okay, we have a couple minutes left. Let's try to get through. Let's go 15 through 18, and then we'll break at the end of this for next week. But if someone to read 15 through 18. Pastor's chosen. Somebody's got to read that.
When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity.
All right, so back in chapter 1, at the beginning of the feast, it was the 3rd year of the king's reign. And here we are in the 7th year, after about a year, right? So going back to some of the conversation earlier, I think there was a separation in time from what happened, and like his anger appears to have lasted several years. Like he was angry. He was an angry guy for a few years. That's my interpretation. So she's chosen, and she's even taken advice of the people around them. She seems to be one that's just going with the flow. Like she's just taking advice. She's not making her own way. She's listening to Mordecai. She's listening to the eunuchs that are responsible for the women. She's taking their advice and doing what she's told. So she's clearly, you step back and look at this, and where's God in this? Well, God's acting through all the people that are around her, getting her in position to be the king. And so verse 17, the king loved Esther more than all the other women. It doesn't say he didn't love the other women. I'll just note that. He loved her more than all the other ones, and set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave us a great feast. And so, and it was Esther's feast. So yet again, another feast. And Wednesday we talked about, he was known, at least according to the Greeks, for levying very, very high taxes. Like he would take over an area and tax everybody. Taxes. And then he also granted remission of taxes at this time. So he got his new wife, and for everyone, he gave them a little tax relief. Found that just a little bit interesting that, in that kind of time, after the war, he gave some tax relief.
True politician.
I think that's it. I really do. So, all right, we will finish chapter 2 on Wednesday, and we'll get into 3 and 4 Wednesday, Sunday. Thank you all. Where's Oxford? Are you one of their teams with Brian Powers and Scrubber for a year? I don't know. If she was one of the beautiful ones, then how ugly were all the other ones?
And Sarah's trying to be studying this. Okay, we have to pay more. God knows you do.
Yep.
See what's going on. It hasn't changed.
Same people being people.
Over there it is.
Yeah.
And you get preferential seating, you get preferential distribution, and all of these things. We even ask them about it, and they say no. So, like Sherry and I said, we do like the room was fabulous. Yeah. Right. I've heard that they're all about, like I think about, and they're all about, yeah, that's what I've heard. Yeah. That sounds spoiled, but I don't know. It's just, I like to be out there. I like to, and I know. I do like that we did that together. So we had like 20 good friends when we got on the boat. It was kind of nice, and then we got together. We could hang out. Like, for example, this is a fun story where we go out to I'm gonna do the coffee, and then we get back on, and she's like, I hope we don't regret that. And one of the guys said, some of the women will have huge for women, right? Yeah. And I said to him, so we get out there, and we're in the line there, and there's a owner, I think that's in our female tour guide comes up with this bathroom. I'm like, so, and